While working on Lolita in late 1961, the acclaimed director Stanley Kubrick heard a radio drama on the BBC called Shadow on the Sun, which was about a meteor falling to the Earth carrying an alien virus. Kubrick, an enthusiast of science fiction literature, Japanese tokusatsu movies, and the possibility of extraterrestrial life, was interested in adapting the radio play, or some version of it, because he felt that nobody in the Western world had yet made a worthwhile science fiction film. After Lolita, he began working on Dr. Strangelove, which had a subplot in the original script about aliens that framed the entire story as a documentary about what happened to the human race. This framing device never saw the light of day, but even while working on Strangelove, Kubrick couldn't shake the idea of making his next film science fiction. When his friend, the jazz legend Artie Shaw, pointed him towards the novel Childhood's End, Kubrick and his wife immediately devoured it, sharing ripped-out pages so they could read the novel together. Unfortunately, the rights to a film version had already been optioned, and the author, according to Shaw, was some kind of recluse living in the tropics. Kubrick told his publicist, Roger Karras, that he was interested in doing science fiction, and Karras told him to just find the best science fiction writer and go from there. When Kubrick asked him who the best science fiction writer was, Karras told him that it was the same man who wrote Childhood's End, and that he wasn't really a recluse. In fact, Karras and the writer were friends. It was then that Stanley Kubrick set out to get in touch with Arthur C. Clarke and make perhaps the greatest science fiction film of all time. In the year 2001, Dr. Heywood Floyd is sent to the moon on urgent business, to see for himself an anomalous object being dug up from beneath the lunar regolith. Once the light of the sun hits the surface of this bizarre monolith, a signal is sent out to distant Jupiter. In an effort to find answers, a ship called the Discovery heads to the gas giant, piloted by Dave Bowman, Frank Poole, and the state-of-the-art artificially intelligent supercomputer HAL 9000. HAL malfunctions, though, killing most of the crew, and soon it is up to Dave Bowman alone to unlock the mystery of the monolith and travel through an alien stargate into the vast unknown. Before we go any further, if you could please hit that like button, this channel might evolve into something beyond the infinite. If you really do like this video, be sure to subscribe as well. Thank you in advance. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. Though certainly not a recluse as Artie Shaw had reported, Arthur C. Clarke did live on the relatively secluded island of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, off the coast of India. And he was a bit jealous that he had never been able to break into Hollywood like his friends and colleagues Robert Heinlein and Ray Bradbury. After learning about the filmmaker's interest from Roger Karras, Clarke received an enthusiastic letter from Stanley Kubrick, urging Clarke to meet him to discuss, quote, the possibility of doing the proverbial really good science fiction movie, unquote. Though Clarke didn't completely agree with Kubrick's assertion that there hadn't yet been any great sci-fi films, he would in his response stick up for Destination Moon, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, Things to Come, When Worlds Collide, and The War of the Worlds. He agreed that the time was ripe for something truly groundbreaking. After sending off his reply, in which he agreed to meet Kubrick for lunch in New York, where he was headed anyway as part of bitter divorce negotiations with his estranged wife Marilyn Mayfield, Clarke stayed up that night and concluded that his story The Sentinel, about lunar explorers finding an alien pyramid on the surface of the moon, would be a good fit for the kind of movie Kubrick had described. When they eventually met for lunch at Trader Vic's, the two men hit it off famously. Kubrick, known for his soft demeanor, ability to instantly absorb information, and a certain manic creative energy, was a perfect match for Clarke's more professorial calm and easily stoked desire to sound well-informed on a broad range of subjects. In other words, Kubrick wanted to pick Clarke's brain, and Clarke loved having his brain picked. During their first lunch meeting, which went on for 8 hours, they hashed out their broad intentions and agreed to work together. Kubrick wanted to not only make a science fiction film, but a work of art, something that dealt with the very soul of the human condition and mankind's place in the universe. When he told Clarke about Shadow on the Sun, Clarke told him that he was only interested in working on something of his own, or at least on something the pair would come up with together. He definitely wasn't interested in anything set entirely on Earth, in the vein of an alien invasion tale. Clarke also did his best to disabuse Kubrick of any notions of UFOs having visited the Earth in real life, as Kubrick was, according to Clarke, quote, in danger of believing in flying saucers, unquote. They would meet several more times and come to a more formal agreement whereby Clarke would write a novel with Kubrick's collaborative input that would serve as the basis for Kubrick's film. Clarke, who tried writing in a screenplay format and hated it, could thus express his ideas the best way he knew how, and Kubrick was confident enough to believe, probably correctly in his case, that he could film anything Clarke could put on a page. Kubrick purchased the rights to several of Clarke's short stories, but the only one of these he ultimately needed was The Sentinel. He and Clarke also borrowed heavily from Clarke's story Encounter in the Dawn, which is about an alien survey expedition to prehistoric Earth where they hope to bring intelligence to early hominids, though Kubrick never purchased the rights to that one. The script went through extensive changes throughout the entire production process. Early on, it was thought that the discovery of the alien artifact on the moon should be the climax of the movie, and for a significant amount of the pre-production, the film included actual glimpses of alien beings. It also went through multiple titles, starting with How the Solar System Was Won, a spin on How the West Was Won, a surprising source of inspiration. Other titles included Journey Beyond the Stars, Planetfall, Universe, and Tunnel to the Stars. According to Clarke, it was Kubrick himself who came up with the title 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is a riff on the Odysseus myth that serves as a structural skeleton for the film. For more details on the multiple different side roads that Kubrick and Clarke went down when fleshing out the story, I highly recommend Arthur C. Clarke's The Lost Worlds of 2001, which was one of two primary sources of information I used for this video. The other being Michael Benson's exhaustively researched 2018 book, Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece, which I also highly recommend. Kubrick hoped to put the movie together in 18 months, which would prove to be stupidly optimistic, and was notably worried that NASA would get to the moon before he could finish the film, or that alien life would be discovered, rendering the whole story moot. He even tried to insure the film against these possibilities through Lloyd's of London, though they didn't take the bet. With funding from MGM and plans to produce the film almost entirely in England, specifically the MGM British Studios in Borehamwood and Shepperton Studios in Surrey, Kubrick set about finding his cast. In his contract with MGM, there had been a list of actors suggested by Kubrick and approved by the studio. For the nominal lead, Dave Bowman, Keir Dullea, known for his breakout performance in David and Lisa, in which he plays a cold and aloof mental patient, was Kubrick's first and last choice. To play Dave's partner, Frank Poole, Kubrick cast the former UCLA footballer Gary Lockwood, who was originally considered for the role of Moonwatcher, the man-ape of the opening sequences. Albert Finney and John Paul Belmondo were also considered for Moonwatcher, and Kubrick personally approached Robert Shaw for the part. However, the role would eventually go to a professional mime, as opposed to a traditional actor, in this case Daniel Richter, the future live-in friend of John Lennon and Yoko Ono. For the secondary lead of Heywood Floyd, the list of actors included Henry Fonda, George C. Scott, and Jason Robards, but Kubrick ultimately settled on William Sylvester, who had played one of the principal roles in Shadow on the Sun, the radio play that had inspired the whole project. Lastly, as the voice of HAL 9000,
I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before,
which was envisioned as a female computer named Athena for most of the early production, Kubrick, after rejecting Nigel Davenport and Martin Balsam, cast the Scottish-Canadian stage actor Douglas Rain, who had done the narration for a documentary called Universe that had been another of Kubrick's inspirations. While we're on the subject of HAL, the name derives from heuristically programmed algorithmic computer, suggested by the co-founder of MIT's artificial intelligence laboratory, Martin Minsky, who was almost killed by a falling wrench on set. Before the script had the main computer turn homicidal, IBM was happy to have its logo plastered on all the computers, including the startlingly accurate tablet computers predicted in a pair of reports to Kubrick by futurists working at Bell Labs. However, the fact that the letters H, A, and L are alphabetically adjacent to I, B, and M is allegedly nothing more than a cheeky coincidence. MGM had hoped for bigger-named stars for the film, but Kubrick felt that the budget would be better served on the special effects, which he was adamant about getting right. He felt science fiction films had never properly conveyed the reality of space, and he was determined to make his movie look and feel more convincing than anything ever produced for the big screen. Now, I could spend hours just talking about the effects of 2001, from the monolith, which was originally conceived of as a tetrahedron or a perspex cube, to the groundbreaking use of front projection. I could talk about the exhaustive design work by Harry Lang and Anthony Masters, or the hard work put in by the science and technology advisor Frederick Ordway, whose sole job during pre-production was to make everything as accurate as possible, and who would later sue Kubrick around the time of the film's release. I could of course talk about the contributions of a young Douglas Trumbull, who got a job as one of the primary special effects supervisors by having the cojones to cold call Stanley Kubrick and ask for it. Or I could talk about the rotating sets and complicated models. I could talk about the fact that all the effects were done in camera to avoid the inevitable degradation that comes with the duplication required for more traditional techniques, and about the complications and innovations that resulted from this mandate, not to mention the remarkable fidelity that still holds up in ultra-high-def 4K remasters today. I could talk about the internecine fight between Kubrick and his effects crew when the director got it in his head to change Discovery's destination from Jupiter to Saturn, a fight that Kubrick ultimately lost. I could talk about the agonizing the team did to figure out how to pull off the floating pen trick, only to eventually settle on nothing more complicated than a sheet of glass and a piece of tape. Or I could talk about the problems that arose from the Dawn of Man opening scenes, which surprisingly proved to be more difficult than any of the space stuff. But suffice to say, the special effects of 2001 were a giant leap forward, perhaps the biggest single leap since 1933's King Kong. Even if 2001: A Space Odyssey did nothing else right, it is certainly one of the most significant landmarks in the history of special effects. Indeed, the only Academy Award the film received was for its effects, though a lot of people were unhappy that the only man who got credit at the time was Stanley Kubrick. For the music, he approached the psychedelic British band Pink Floyd, who turned him down because of prior commitments. Kubrick, at the behest of MGM, then hired Alex North, who he'd worked with before on Spartacus and Dr. Strangelove. However, Kubrick opted not to use the score North delivered, replacing it with the classical music he'd been using during editing. Alex North didn't find out about the change until the film premiered in April of 1968, a full 4 years after the fateful lunch meeting between Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. The initial premiere in LA and New York, screened for critics, cast, crew, and the Hollywood elite, was an unmitigated disaster. A total of 241 people walked out of the New York premiere, including Arthur C. Clarke, who left during the intermission in tears after hearing the audience's chattering, chuckling, and jeering reaction to the film. Kubrick himself was devastated and became uncharacteristically insecure, unable to sleep because he thought he had failed. The first round of critical reviews were overwhelmingly scathing, with the movie derided for being slow, amateurish, boring, meaningless, pretentious, self-indulgent, and dull. Even Arthur C. Clarke was initially negative on the film in private, though he wouldn't admit it in public until well after his novel released, and studio execs at MGM were worried that the film would be such a financial albatross that it would sink the entire studio. In panicked, closed-door sessions with MGM's top brass, Kubrick agreed to some hasty cuts to the film before its wider release, trimming about 19 minutes of largely repetitive footage. A lot of speculation surrounds whether these cuts were Kubrick's idea or MGM's demand, but Kubrick stood by them for the rest of his life, even burning the only known copies of the cut footage shortly before his death. After its, let's say, disappointing premieres, the freshly cut version of Kubrick's film did get a fairly remarkable critical turnaround. Some critics held fast to their negative opinions of the film, but a few wrote unprecedented mea culpas after viewing the shorter cut and having time to reconsider it. Regardless of what the critics of the time thought, though, as soon as the general public had access to the film, people came in droves. 2001: A Space Odyssey did good business with audiences, especially younger ones, making just under $22 million in theater rentals in its initial worldwide run, against a budget of as much as $12 million. When it started getting popular among a certain subset of late 60s youth, one San Francisco man ran through a theater screen exulting it's God. After this, MGM decided against pulling the film early and released a new poster with a new tagline, calling 2001, quote, "The Ultimate Trip," unquote. It had several re-releases in the years that followed, starting in 1971 and continuing at least to the film's 50th anniversary in 2018, when director Christopher Nolan oversaw the release of a 70mm print in theaters and IMAX screens across the country. To date, the movie has made an estimated grand total of as much as $190 million at the worldwide box office, though it gets tricky to properly adjust the figures for inflation. Steven Spielberg called 2001 the Big Bang for filmmakers of his generation, who found themselves deeply moved and inspired by Kubrick's vision. These days, it is a frequent fixture on top 10 lists of greatest films ever made, and in the humble opinion of this geek, it is, without hyperbole, the best and most important science fiction film of all time. I've been putting off doing this review, not only because I've absorbed enough information about the movie to fill 24 of these videos, but because I just don't think I'm capable of doing it justice. There are those out there who still think the movie is dull and pretentious, people who aren't hypnotized by the experience Kubrick put forth, and though I am usually loath to deny people their honest opinions, those people are just wrong. I grant that perhaps it's not the most entertaining ride that sci-fi cinema has to offer, but it is certainly one of the most competent, artistic, and awe-inspiring. It also goes as deep as you want to go with it. Arthur C. Clarke's expressed vision for the film's meaning was the search for truth. Everything that happens in the plot is in service to this theme, and Hal's breakdown, which was intended to be explained more in the film, but Kubrick ultimately cut out the exposition, concerns the artificial intelligence's conundrum in hiding the truth from Bowman and Poole. Granted, as an explanation, this lacks a lot of detail, but it does serve as an interesting starting point for analyzing the film. As for Kubrick, he stubbornly refused to explain anything, arguing that it was always his intention for the metaphysical and philosophical meaning of his movie to be communicated to the viewer on an unconscious level, to use visual and auditory stimulation to affect the viewer in a psychological but not conversational manner. It's why there is so little meaningful dialogue in the movie, and why Kubrick ultimately decided not to use the voiceover narration he and Clarke had planned on. He did push back a little bit on certain critics and academics who contended the conclusion is cynical and apocalyptic, based on a misreading of the final paragraph of Clarke's novel, but for the most part, he wanted the movie to mean whatever its viewers want it to mean. Of course, Stanley Kubrick movies are notorious for being absolute rabbit holes in this regard, with movies like The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut being a source of endless debate and subtextual readings, and 2001: A Space Odyssey is perhaps the most enigmatic of them all. It can be seen as a treatise on violence and aggression, as a retelling of Homer's Odyssey for the space age, a stab at secular spirituality, a commentary on evolution or the cycle of death and rebirth, a weird retelling of Frankenstein, and much else. Pretty much any scene can be picked apart to unravel all kinds of meaning. For example, take just the opening shot of the sun above the crescent Earth. The iconography of a crescent and sun goes back to antiquity, and is sometimes associated with Zoroastrianism, the first monotheistic religion on record. The founder, Zoroaster, is also known as Zarathustra. The music playing during this sequence is, of course, Richard Strauss's Thus Spake Zarathustra, which was named after a book by Friedrich Nietzsche, who is famous for arguing that modern man is a stepping stone between the ape man and the Ubermensch, much as Dave Bowman could be seen as a stepping stone between Moonwatcher and the Star Child. There are also several repeated motifs that invite conjecture, things like birthdays and the consumption of food. Other tiny details that can go all but unnoticed, like Hal's subtle mistake in this chess game, can open up whole avenues of plot speculation, thematic reevaluation, and potential new meaning. Long academic papers have been devoted to things as small as this, and more ink has been spilled in trying to explain the whole of 2001: A Space Odyssey than any other film ever made. As much fun as these hunts for meaning can be, and trust me, I love doing this kind of thing, I don't really believe that Kubrick had any singular and specific interpretation in mind. There are some interpretations that are probably wrong. For example, I've come across one analysis that argues the shape of the monolith reveals that the movie is about the transcendent quality of film itself. But if you know how that shape came together during production, you'll know it was a rectangle out of technical expediency, not out of its relationship to the dimensions of a theater screen. That said, I've come around to completely agree with Kubrick. The movie means whatever you want it to mean. I don't think that makes it intellectually lazy or amateurish, quite the opposite really, because Kubrick was, as he told Clarke right at the start, always trying to portray in film the entire nature of humanity and its place in the cosmos. These concepts are, by their very nature, enigmatic and the source of endless debate. So maybe we can't agree on a definitive answer, because we have not yet become Star Children. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What do you think 2001 means? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I have to offer a special thank you to everyone who's gotten me to this point, because I'm releasing this video as I pass the 2001 subscriber mark. Thank you. If you'd like to read more of my thoughts on 2001, 2010, and the entire series of books by Clarke, head on over to my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find plenty of written reviews of sci-fi classics in both film and literature. And you can also support me on Patreon to get access to bonus content, get your name in the credits, and more. Until next time, though, when I'll review the movie I hinted at last time, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
See you next Wednesday.